Hey everybody, Nick here, and today I got a quick video for you to share a hint to a really common question the last few days for whatever reason, and that's, Nick, how do I get my knife centered? The centering of a blade is that when the blade is closed, you want, in a perfect world, for the blade to be exactly centered between the scales. This ensures that it won't contact the scale at any point during the opening and closing process. It looks pretty, frankly, as another centered blade. And when the centering is off, like on this little guy right here, or on this Bach River Zancudo that I'm using as an illustrative example here, that can be a bit of a problem. So I want to talk about the couple of strategies that I use to maintain and improve centering on a knife. The very first one that I do is I just take the knife apart and put it back together. It's often the case, in my experience, that during the initial assembly, something went wrong. Maybe a little piece of, some little piece of chip from the machining got between one of the washers and the blade. And that can be enough, especially on a knife with tight tolerances, to completely screw your centering. And so taking the knife apart, lubing everything up, cleaning everything out, can often be a great way to initially fix that. Sometimes it's the case that you do nothing except take the knife down, clean it up, put it back together, and the centering is now perfect. But let's pretend that you put it back together and your centering is not perfect. Next thing to take a look at is your your pivot tension. So watch this. Right now, this knife is not centered really at all. It's pretty ugly in terms of the centering department. What I'm going to do now is just use, and this is an EC Zancudo, by the way. What I'm going to do is I'm going to loosen the pivot here, and then you're going to watch the centering change as I do. See? Slowly, the centering is changing. And this is just due to the fact that a lock bar on a knife, specifically a frame lock, but also a liner lock, is going to, sometimes a compression, is going to press the blade in this direction. So when the pivot is loose, it basically allows the lock bar tension to press the blade to one side or to the other. And so if I really over-tighten the pivot, the centering is going to be very strongly favoring the lock bar side. And if I really under-tighten the pivot, the centering, that is going to favor the presentation side. And so that's another thing you got to keep in mind. Your next step when you're putting the knife back together for centering fix is to make sure that your lock bar tension is in position. So, of course, though, it's sometimes the case that the lock bar tension is, the pivot torque is correct, meaning there's no blade play, it travels freely, but there's still a centering issue. And in fact, that is kind of the case for this knife right here. So let's go on to the next approach. The next approach is actually to look at the handle itself. Very often, if you take a knife apart and then put it back together, gotta switch drivers here, it's the case that the handle screws, the scale screws, actually play a role in keeping torque kind of distributed through the handle of the knife. I'm not an engineer. I don't have a fancy vocabulary for any of this, but it's just the case that depending on the position of the blade when you're putting the knife together and when you're tightening down the scale screws, you can have very different kind of centering as a result. If you tighten the scale screws down, well, the body of the knife is torqued in one particular way. It will kind of maintain that torque as opposed to another one. And so the next piece of advice I usually give is to put the blade out at a 90-degree angle like this, because that's kind of a fairly neutral position for the lock bar and for the knife itself. It kind of makes sure that everything is in the, when it's down this way, the lock bar is ducked into the detent hole a little bit, and when it's out here, the lock bar is pulled in, but this provides a nice neutral position for the body of the knife. And so, in fact, when I put that back together like that, my centering changed again. So that's interesting. That's good to know. Let me change the pivot tension and see a little bit whether that fixes it. So I'm going to loosen the pivot slightly and see whether... Now I've got a little bit of blade play. So great, this is excellent. I've got a problem here. The pivot tension is not good enough. I'm going to tighten the pivot tension to where I need it to be real quick. Yeah, it should be a little bit tighter, but when I've got it there, the centering is off. So my next step actually is going to be, and this is kind of a trial and error sort of process. On some knives, particularly ones with poor manufacturing tolerances, or just some brands, the Southern Grind Spider Monkey comes to mind. Rick Hinderer, his mid-techs tend to have these issues. It's really a big process to find a position where the knife is well centered. So the next approach that I'll sometimes take is I'll take a little piece of like cardboard or something along those lines. I'll cut this guy down. There we go. And then what you do is you kind of make a little bit of a wedge. And then you need to, you know that in order for this blade to be centered, it needs to go a little bit that direction. And so I'll use this little chunk of cardboard here, oh, come on, you little bugger, to actually press the knife blade a little bit towards the side I need it to favor, the side I want to move towards. Then what I do is I unscrew the pivot a little bit here, and then I tighten the pivot back down a little bit. And then I'll do the same thing for the scale screws. Because again, in some knives, that actually makes a difference. In a lot of knives, particularly on the higher end, it really doesn't. But all I need to do here is untorque the scale screws a little bit, and then tighten them back down, one by one. And now I tighten my pivot screw back down again with this little thing in there, hopefully providing some counter resistance. That's way too tight now. Let's back it off slightly. We are pretty close to centered at this point in time. What I might do is just one more time, maybe a little bit more severely, so I'll add another fold here or use a slightly thicker material. But just one more time, kind of slide this in there so the blade's really hugging the edge. Tweak those scale screws one more time just to see if I can get that right. And again, I want to emphasize, this is very often not a problem. On your higher-end knives or your well-built lower-end knives, this is not an issue. This knife particularly I chose because I saw it had bad centering and because it's a low-end knife. And so very often you're going to run into these kinds of fiddly assemblies as opposed to on knives that have better tolerances where it's really not an issue. So now I pop this out of there. Centering actually looks good. No blade play. It's not 100% perfect, but it's damn good. So, I mean, that's kind of my approach here, and we're back to a centered. And before this was Disassembly. Oh, it's still a little bit off, and it could actually be that the blade is a little bit warped. Sometimes you got to keep that in mind. But yeah, this was very, very not centered when I first started on this guy, and now it's in a little bit better shape. But those are my strategies. Do the disassembly just to start with, then play with the pivot tension a little bit, see if that fixes it. If that doesn't fix it, put it back together with the blade at 90 degrees and redo all of your scale screws here, just to store up that position. And then if that doesn't work, use some piece of something or another to wedge the blade to the side it needs to move towards, and do the reassembly with that wedge back in there, and see if that does the trick. Remember, though, that sometimes knives are just not centered. There are knives that are built with poor quality control that will never be centered. I can sit there and I can fiddle for hours and months and weeks and days. I don't know why I presented those things in that order, and it will just never happen. Some Benchmades I've had, I had an Endura that was like that. And that's just a ding on the knife. That's a problem, and at that point, you send it back to your Benchmade. You bother people about it, because that's not cool. But sometimes using those four methods, disassembly, pivot tension, 90-degree reassembly, and then wedged reassembly, you can get things back to centered. Hopefully it'll work for you, but again, there's no guarantees, and at the end of the day, sometimes you might need to surrender and just realize that your knife is never going to be perfectly centered, kind of like this guy, which is still a whole lot better than when it started. When it started, it was a lot closer to here. So, anyways, there you go. Hope this was helpful, hope it was interesting, and have yourselves an absolutely wonderful rest of the day, and may all of your knives have good tolerances and be centered out of the box with no worries whatsoever. Bye now.